So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Nat Perry. I'm Head of Communications at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and this is the press conference for the International Election Observation Mission to the presidential election that took place here in the Russian Federation yesterday. So this mission has been a joint endeavor of two OSCE institutions working together. We have the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR. They've had a long-term observation mission in the country since February 5th, and that's been led by Ambassador Jan Peterson. He'll be offering the remarks of the long-term observer mission. We also have Mr. Michael Georg Link, who has been appointed by the OSCE chairperson in office as the special coordinator of the short-term observer mission, and he's been designated to deliver the preliminary statements. And we have Marriott today of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which had a delegation of about 100 observers. So we'll begin with Mr. Link. So Mr. Link, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nat. Thank you to all of you for coming here today to our press briefing. My name, as I heard, is Michael Georg Link, a Member of Parliament from the German Bundestag, and please say if there is anything you cannot understand, if the acoustics are fine, let me know, let us know, we can adapt. I am the appointed OSCE Special Coordinator appointed by the OSCE Chairman for this election observation, also delivering today's statement together, of course, with my two colleagues here. I am joined, and I'm very, very glad for that, by Marietta today, Member of Parliament from Italy, the head of the OSCE EPA delegation for this election, and of course of Ambassador Jan Peterson, who is heading the ODIHR mission for this election. I will come back to that in a second. The colleagues will, as you heard, speak after me. These conclusions that we present to you today are based on a serious effort and on criteria that the Russian Federation has committed herself to. And fulfilling, of course, these commitments is whether these commitments are being fulfilled or not. That is the job of electoral observation. So we are measuring here against a commitment made by the Russian Federation. This joint statement has been elaborated by both the OSCE Office for Democratization and Human Rights, the ODIHR, and by the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE. I mentioned the two heads of the delegation here with me. I warmly thank the ODIHR Moscow core team and the ODIHR long and short-term observers for their highly professional and outstanding performance. I equally thank more than 100 parliamentarians from more than 30 countries serving as short-term observers in these elections. There were long-term observers in the country for many weeks, and we deployed altogether more than 500 observers countrywide yesterday, including, as I said, long-term observers. So this is a long and consistent picture. Our main conclusions are that, and now I will read the first 3 paragraphs of the statement, which will be handed out to you in both languages, of course, at the end, or maybe it's already at reach, but this is now the next three paragraphs are the direct quotes from this first part of the statements. The 18 March presidential election took place in an overly controlled legal and political environment, marked by continued pressure on critical voices, while the Central Election Commission administered the election efficiently and openly. After intense efforts to promote turnout, citizens voted in significant numbers, yet restrictions on the fundamental freedoms of assembly, association and expression, as well as on candidate registration, have limited the space for political engagement and resulted in a lack of genuine competition. While candidates could generally campaign freely, the extensive and uncritical coverage of the incumbent as president in most media resulted in an uneven playing field. Overall, election day was conducted in an orderly manner, despite shortcomings related to vote secrecy and transparency of counting. 8 candidates, 1 woman and 7 men, stood in this election, including the incumbent president as self-nominated and others fielded by political parties. Positively, recent amendments significantly reduced the number of supporting signatures required for candidate registration. 17 prospective candidates were rejected by the CEC, and 6 of them challenged the CEC decisions unsuccessfully in the Supreme Court. Remaining legal restrictions on candidates' rights are contrary to OSCE commitments and other international standards and limit the inclusiveness of the candidate registration process. Most candidates publicly expressed their certainty that the incumbent president would prevail in the election, with many of the candidates themselves stating that they did not expect to win. The election lacked genuine competition. Thus, efforts to increase the turnout predominated over the campaign of the contestants. A number of activists who questioned the legitimacy of the election were detained. Instances of pressure on voters to take part in the election were reported to the ODIHR Election Observation Mission. All these violations contravene a number of OSCE commitments and other international obligations regarding freedom and equality in the campaign. Let me add now some further remark linked to this observation. After reading these three, I repeat, first 3 paragraphs of the whole statement. You will hear later about the whole statement, certainly by my colleagues, and as I said, you will get it certainly in full length in both languages. I want to underline that legal and technical aspects of the election were administered efficiently with the Central Electoral Commission headed by Ella Alexandrovna Pamfilova. The cooperation was open-minded, professional and reliable, and I notably want to thank the CEC chairwoman for this on behalf of the OSCE. The CEC also took measures to address the persistent allegations of voter coercion. But that being said, we have continued to hear serious concerns regarding, for example, the composition of lower-level election commissions impacting their impartiality. Let me summarize our very detailed report as follows, in my own words. A choice without a real competition, as we have seen in this election, unfortunately is not a real choice. Where the legal framework restricts many fundamental freedoms and the outcome is not in doubt, elections almost lose their purpose of empowering people to choose their leaders. During this observation, let me say, and drawing to an end, that we have enjoyed the warm and sincere hospitality deeply rooted in Russian culture. We worked here in a spirit full of sympathy for the Russian people, and we will gladly be returning to this fantastic city of Moscow officially as well as for private visits. As observers, we are working based on a transparent methodology. We have been mandated by the OSCE to do so. Given that there were many other foreign observers, and let me clearly state that for obvious reasons, given that there were many other foreign observers accredited in Russia yesterday, I want to stress that not all of these observers are alike. Let me be very clear. Individual visits by people invited by state authorities is not the same as an actual mission deployed by an internationally mandated organization, such as the OSCE, with experience from hundreds of previous observation missions, building both an ODIHR's methodology and on the political wisdom and backing of the parliamentarians from the OSCE. I'm proud of the work we do together here jointly, ODIHR and the parliamentarians, together in the OSCE family. I sincerely hope that other less credible groups are not allowed to tarnish the important work that we as internationally recognized observers of the OSCE are doing. As I said, this was a joint effort. So I hand over now to the head of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly delegation, Ms. Margherita Tidei, Member of Parliament from Italy, as I said, followed then by the head of the ODIHR mission for these elections, former Norwegian Foreign Minister Jan Petersen. Thank you for your attention and looking forward later to your questions.
Thank you, Michael. And before adding my own comments, I want to stress that I fully support everything that Michael Links has already said. This was a cooperative effort, and I appreciate the close work we had all had. Let me start by reiterating the appreciation of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly mission for the good cooperation we had enjoyed with the authorities here, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Duma, and particularly the Central Election Commission, headed by Ella Pamfilova, have all been helpful in facilitating our work here. Really, thank you. OSCE parliamentarians have observed all the presidential and parliamentary elections in the Russian Federation going back to 1993. As a body of politicians ourselves, we know what democracy consists of. Elections are a critical part of democracy, but democracy is not only about the election. Some positive legal changes and good work by the Central Election Commission are welcome, but improving the real state of democracy in Russia requires full respect for people's rights, also between elections. The ability for candidates to generate campaign freely in recent weeks needs to be extended to all of society. I welcome the legal change that enabled voting in a polling station other than where someone is resident, which it seems some 5.6 million have made use of. Efforts to facilitate voting are welcome and important, even if it's resulted in some difficulties in polling station yesterday. In the field of media, we do raise concerns that the restriction on media present a challenge to freedom of expression. While the incumbent president did not participate in debates or in campaigning, extensive and unchallenged news coverage of these official activities continue to provide him with dominant presence in the media. In the end, I think we can say that most media did not present voters with a critical assessment of the incumbent's views. This is unfortunate. A number of changes in the election legislation took place since the last presidential election, some addressing previous recommendations, and we very much welcome that recommendations are taken on, because election and democracy are a process. For OSCE parliamentary observers, our immediate work here in Russia this week has been relatively short. However, we have a long-term commitment to working together with Russia. This relates, of course, to the issue, positive and negative, that we are mentioning today, but also to many other issues of international importance. Finally, before passing the floor to Ambassador Peterson, I want to say something exclusively on behalf of the OSCE PA. This comment is outside of the confines of this mission, as it relates to voting outside of the territory of Russia, we did not directly observe. However, as an OSCE PA Vice President, as a member of Parliament, as a believer in the importance of democratic rights, and as a voter, I'm deeply disappointed that Ukrainian authorities yesterday did not provide adequate conditions for Russian residents in Ukraine to vote. I fully understand the difficult situation of relations between Russia and Ukraine, but the fundamental right to citizens to vote should not be a casualty of conflicts between governments. I thank you for your attention, and now, Mr. Peterson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Peterson. I'm also head of the OSCE Election Observation Mission. Perhaps first I should underline what our findings are based on. We have had a core team in Moscow for the last 6 weeks, which and our analysts have been analyzing throughout this period. Almost for as long, we were helped by 60 long-term observers being deployed throughout the Russian Federation, reporting back to us everything which they have been observing in their areas of operation. And just this weekend, we were joined by 291 teams of short-term observers. You can multiply them by 2 to have the numbers, which have been reporting back on how they observed the election day. And this is actually the biggest observation mission we have ever had in the Russian Federation. So I think we can say that we have a solid basis of observation behind our findings. I should then perhaps go on to thank the Russian authorities for inviting us to observe. Thank the seconding countries for seconding so many observers. We have observers from 44 countries, which is a big number. And not least to all our interlocutors, government officials, local officials, representatives from parties, from campaigns, experts, media representatives, civil society. They have all contributed a great to our understanding of the situation. And thanks to our parliamentary colleagues, which leads me to the important underlining that these findings are our joint findings, as stated in our preliminary statement, which means that when it comes to substance, actually I can only show to what Mr. Link and Mr. Tede has just said. But perhaps I might just underline a few points. As you will see, we start our finding with noting that this election took place in an overly controlled legal and political environment, marked by continued pressure on critical voices. But we also go on to underline that the Central Election Commission has administered the elections efficiently and openly. And indeed, we say later on that legal and technical aspects of elections were administered efficiently and within the deadlines. And we also say that the lower level commissions overall prepared the elections efficiently. Even if when you read our report, you will see that there are some issues of concern which we do raise. We have, for those of, we have also in the introductory paragraph underlined that there are restrictions on the fundamental freedoms of assembly, association and expression, as well as on candidate registration, and those have limited the space for political engagement and resulted in a lack of genuine competition. For those of you who might have had a chance to leaf through our report, you would later in the report see that we are substantiating these use with a lot of details, which I would urge you to study. There are, of course, a couple of striking features in the election, namely that the efforts to promote the turnout were more visible than the campaign itself. And we also include an assessment of the media situation, which makes it clear that it has not been a level playing field. We also deal with the legal framework, saying that it is way too complicated. Actually, this is the same conclusion as we drew from our observations in the Duma elections in 2016, but it is still of concern to us. You will see from the report that all our main conclusions are backed up by findings from our teams throughout the countries. But as Mr. Link said, this is a report which all the three of us are behind. So this was just paraphrasing your introductory words. Just perhaps one final thing. In 2 months' time, you will have ODIHR's final report with the recommendations. These are our preliminary findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for those remarks. So we do have some time for questions from journalists now. If you have any questions, we have microphones on the side of the room here. So please just give us your name and identify your media outlet and ask your question.
Алексей Гусаров, «Эхо Москвы».
Alexei Gusarov, I'm from Echo Moscow. Is it correct to compare today's elections against the previous ones in terms of number of irregularities? We want to know whether we are progressing towards democracy or we are going backwards.
Thank you very much. It is actually a very clear part of our methodology that we always observe election and assess them on the basis of what we see during these elections, which means that we don't go into any extensive comparison between elections. And I think actually that that would be wrong. So what you will see from our report is an assessment of what we see now, assessed against the obligations which the Russian Federation has entered into. You will see some parts of it, especially in our final report in 2 months' time, where we on how our recommendations have been followed up. And early recommendations, well, some of them have been followed up, some of them not. But we don't give any sweeping assessment of how elections compare with each other.
No, I just want to add something. As the ambassador said, we cannot compare election, but we can see that some addressing previous recommendation are taken on. So I think it's positive.
And very briefly, observation is not commenting. The political conclusions from the observation must be brought, must be made by the general public, by the journalists, by the general public, by the states, by parties. But it's not our job to draw political conclusions. We state what we observe, not more, not less.
Thank you for that question. Do we have any more journalists who would like to ask a question? I guess that means that oh, here we have one, please.
El País, Spain, 300 persons, among them deputies and members of parliament, have been invited by the head of the International Committee of the Duma. Yeah, do you consider them observers? What is your position about them? Did you see them? Did you cooperate? And do you know where the money for that observation comes from? And have you been appealed by the head of the International Committee to come here and declined? Thank you.
Ms. Today, would you like to take that?
Well, I think I addressed that already, saying clearly that individual invitations to individual, for example, other members of parliament, of course, well, it's not our job to teach or lecture here anybody else, but this is not international recognized electoral observation what they are doing, because we have international commitments and international rules. For example, the OSCE has, with the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, one very experienced parliamentary body, specialized, among others, on these things. And the Ministerial Council decisions of the OSCE officially endorse and empower ODIHR and the PA to have joint election observations. So we have an international mandate to observe. These others are individual observers invited on individual basis. This is not an internationally recognized mandate.
If I might just add to your answer, it is important to underline that ODIHR has a code of conduct and a methodology which has been developed over the observation of more than 300 elections. And we are very, very clear that we need to provide our own facts, to have proper facts behind our findings. So we are in many ways a self-contained operation. Whoever observes, well, that is not part of what from for my mission, it's important to say that we work only according to the methodology developed by ODIHR.
Thank you for that. I see another question here in the third row.
Cristina Giuliano, Asca News from Italy. I would like to have some details from you. When you talk about lack of genuine competition, what do you mean?
Mr. Link, please.
Well, for example, the fact that we had noticed that in the electoral campaign, of course, there have been different candidates, but of course, by having not electoral campaign where all the candidates, for example, were addressing the same interviews, TV shows, debates. You had separate ideas. You had certainly one clear front runner, which is understandable when it's the incumbent, but a real competition, of course, needs, of course, also the possibility of a level playing field. And therefore, we outline with concrete examples where we cannot see a level playing field between the different candidates. That is what we mean by that. We can offer you concrete examples in the text itself and in the footnotes for that. But many of you, I'm sure, were also following these TV debates where notably one candidate was absent.
If I perhaps could add a little bit to that, I mean, that's is one reason actually why I just pointed you to our media section, because there is no doubt that there were possibilities for debate, which the candidates took advantage of, with one notable exception. But if you see the media picture as a whole, you would see that the incumbent president did not participate in any debate and were not in any way, I mean, subject to critical questions and debates. And in his capacity as president, he had quite wide coverage. Which brings me to one thing which I think it's important to underline, that there seems to be this idea that there is something called a campaign, which can be distinguished quite clearly from the rest of the political life, as these were something on two different planets. We know, of course, that in the real world, there are seamless connections between the campaign and the ordinary political life. And that is why we in the media chapter raise some questions as to how this really is working, and whether this could be called a level playing field. It was also quite striking that quite a few of the candidates stated that they were not expecting to win, which is in itself an interesting comment.
So I see another question in the back row here.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, are we going to expect some numbers and some statistics about this uneven playing field in your final report, so where we can see which candidate had how many minutes? And the second question would be, yesterday we witnessed a lot of nice videos of ballot stuffing and kind of impressive cases of abuse. How are you going to deal with those? I mean, there's Golos, as you know, they speak about 2,500 or some more. Some of them have been accepted by the Central Election Commission, others have not. How are you going to deal with those accusations, and are we going to read about this too?
Ambassador Peterson?
When it comes to the last question, we are in our report referring to the ballot stuffing which was observed by our observers, and the number is 7 seen by our observers. Of course, these are irregularities, and we point to them. When you ask about numbers on the media, we had an extensive media monitoring, which means that we will flesh this out with some numbers, which you will see in the report. We have been covering the media for almost 6 weeks, so I think these are interesting conclusions.
I believe we have time for one more question here.
Well, please again. You have your established methods of observations, which have been practicing for many years, but we live in a changing world, and there are a lot of new technologies. My question is, after what you have seen in these elections in Russia, do you have more elements to consider some revision, some adaptation of your methods in order to integrate the procedures which are being used? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I got the question. If it was on the methodology, that's definitely about my pay grade. If it goes for the Russian Federation, I would... then the answer is clear that, of course, we will come up with a suggestion on improvements and on changes. Actually, that is something that is done in all election observation missions. Just to give an example, in my own country, Norway, we changed the way we administered the elections after the 2013 report by ODIHR. So recommendations is, those are real integral parts of our final reports. Yeah. That was my first answer, and I said that is way above my pay grade, because we are here for this mission, but ODIHR in Warsaw is certainly following very closely what we are doing and constantly refining. But perhaps the former director of ODIHR, since you want to answer the question.
Of course, it would be very bad if the methodology would simply sit in the museum. No, of course, it is updated when there is the need that we have, for example, new challenges. A very recent new challenge for many of us on all sides, especially, of course, for the experts. Also in the ODIHR is really challenging the challenges, the new questions brought with electronic voting. Since many years, of course, this is being tested in more and more countries, in more and more ways. That is why the experts of ODIHR are very actively examining, checking these new possibilities, and in order to be able to really follow and really control how this is being used. But therefore, this is never standing still. Or take the code of conduct on the parliamentary side. There have been recently really, really heavy discussions after some misuse by parliamentarians, in this case in the Council of Europe, of their observation mandate, leading then, of course, now to a research on how can we improve the methodology on the parliamentary side by a stronger code of conduct. And that is now up for discussion. Right now it's being discussed. Absolutely, that needs to be discussed. It should not stand still, and everything can always be improved. We should not rely only exclusively on status quo, but we have to develop with the existing challenges. Absolutely clear.
We have one more question, please.
Alexei
Samachvalov from the Information Agency. Last Friday, the first channel, Russian TV channel, broadcasted the show, the humor show, fun show, where Putin was shown for 37 times, and the presence of the president is not his duty to be a part of the humor show. Don't you think this is a misuse of the executive authorities? Misuse of the resource?
Late, so I'm not sure I got the first part of your question, which means it's pretty dangerous to try to answer it. But this instance is not something we are, or this question is not something we are going into in our report, and I need to consider that further before I give you a firm answer on that.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Is there maybe time for one more? Okay. Last question, please.
Thank you, Елена Barasheva, Deutsche Welle. I will ask it in Russian. And I see that you were focused on your observations, but perhaps you can elaborate on the Navalny headquarters unit, how they observed the election process. Please comment on that. Navalny unit.
You asked me to, in many ways, to assess, if I understood your question correctly, to assess the Navalny campaign. That is not something we are doing, but we are mentioning, of course, relevant phenomena in our report. That means candidate registration, that means a legal background to it, that means how his aides have been treated. So these are part of the report. But there's no chapter called Navalny, but you will see that we deal with all relevant elements actually in the election campaign. And when it comes to registration, I just wanted to remind that he's just one of 7 names having complained before the Supreme Court. So that is why we have a different approach to these issues, because we want to have an even hand. We are not, but that is actually part of my first part of the question, that we are not observing the observers. But we are, of course, describing observations, and we note that the scope for civil society observers are not there. We are commenting on the civic chambers observers, but not going particularly into this question.
Well, thank you all for those questions, and I believe some of your answers might also be found in the report, which is available outside the room and will be on our website at osc.org. So with that, I will close the press conference. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.